The Chicago Bears signed a former Pro Bowl kick returner, but he's coming off of the worst season of his career. So, is the Bears' return game problem solved, or do they still have more work to do?
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. On the show today, we'll get to know the latest Chicago Bears free agent signing, Devin Duvernay, coming over from the Jacksonville Jaguars, previously with the Baltimore Ravens. We'll take a look at what he's been able to do over his career and how that projects to what we can expect for the Chicago Bears. We'll look at how he fits in at the wide receiver depth chart, in addition to the kick return conversation, where he definitely has been better as a punt returner than a kickoff returner. And maybe the Bears will still have some competition there, especially depending on what Duvernay's contract actually ends up being. The cheaper it is, the more open that competition will be. But Duvernay is a name we've talked about a couple of different times, or at least mentioned a couple of different times on this very podcast. If you've been tuning in and making us your first listen every day, you're not a stranger to that name, Devin Duvernay, as an option we floated out with familiarity to Bears passing game coordinator Press Taylor, who was the Jaguars offensive coordinator last season when they signed Devin Duvernay. Now, they didn't have much success with Duvernay in Jacksonville, but at least you have that familiarity of Press Taylor knows exactly what went right and more so what went wrong with Duvernay in Jacksonville, knows how Duvernay handled himself at practice, in the locker room, in the offseason, etc. Like, there's a familiarity with the players so they can have a little bit more of a level of comfort with what they're bringing in as this outside free agent. But a former third-round pick out of Texas back in 2020 to the Baltimore Ravens, was kind of a rotational receiver for them for a few seasons, and really peaked in 2022, at least offensively, with 407 catches on 407 yards, not 407 catches, 37 catches for 407 yards and 3 touchdowns as sort of a starting receiver-ish in that Ravens offense. That was the year they had, basically Rashad Bateman, I think, was their number one weapon. They were really particularly thin at wide receiver, and that's where like a former third-round pick who's more of a return specialist ends up stepping into more of a starting role. They had DeMarcus Robinson there, I think, and a couple of other young guys, but the Ravens passing game needed some work there, and that's where someone like Duvernay can carve out a role as little more of a slot player than an outside receiver, but he's not as tiny physically as the likes of Olamide Zaccheaus, who the Bears already signed as a free agent. Or like we were talking about, Rondale Moore as a possibility, although he just signed elsewhere. Mecole Hardman just signed elsewhere. And former Chicago Bears kick returner DeAndre Carter also just signed elsewhere. So the return man market has been moving pretty quickly here, and the Bears were sure to get their guy in Duvernay, who I think there's some offensive upside here, but it's just been a while since we've seen it. Right? He had that 400-yard season in 2022. His last year in Baltimore, they added a lot at wide receiver, and he fell out of the rotation, and he only had, 4 catches for 18 yards all season. He was injured for a little bit of that season. He's been injured a little bit the last handful of seasons, but it really wasn't a factor at all on offense in 2023. Goes to the Jaguars on a decent-sized, for kick returner, a decent-sized contract. Never really carves out an offensive role there either. Has less than 80 yards receiving on the season, just 11 catches. Hasn't scored an offensive touchdown, or really, I don't think any touchdown since 2022. The upside is there as someone who could be, a number 4 type receiver in this offense, number 5 receiver with some special teams upside there, like what DeAndre Carter was for the Bears last season, a return man who maybe occasionally rotates in, and for a guy who's been able to get, 200, 300, 400 receiving yards, like that feels to me like a reasonable role for him in this Bears offense. The bigger value, of course, though, is as a return man, where he made the Pro Bowl twice, once in 2021 and in 2022. It has been then 2 years since he has been a Pro Bowl return man, but back-to-back years in the Pro Bowl is nothing to sneeze at for Duvernay, and it's been a little bit of a drop-off since, and this past year in Jacksonville was a particularly big drop-off, but there's still plenty of upside here, right? This is a player who led the league in yards per punt return in 2021 at 13.8, and until this past season, averaged at least 11.5 yards per punt return in every year of his career. A consistently productive punt returner. I think technically, it's a really small sample size, but technically, Devin Duvernay averages more yards per punt return in his career than Devin Hester in his career. But obviously, Duvernay has been 5 seasons, and very, very, very unfair comparison there. But it kind of gives you a sense of like, yes, this has been, with the exception of 2024, consistently one of the better punt returners in the NFL. Although he does not have a punt return touchdown in his career. His career long was 70 yards in 2023. This past season, despite averaging a career low 8.8 yards per punt return, he did have a 53-yard punt return, but it was not a touchdown on that play. So like there is home run ability there as a punt returner. And he has 2 kickoff return touchdowns in his career as well. One as a rookie in 2020 and one in his second Pro Bowl season in 2022. The problem for me with Duvernay is that the kickoff returning hasn't been nearly as strong of a suit for him. This past season, he got his average back up to 25 yards per kickoff return, which is historically has been pretty good, but everybody's kickoff return average went up this season because they changed the kickoff rules to have, closer kick returns. And functionally, Devin Duvernay is towards the bottom of the NFL in yards per kickoff return average. Only a couple of kick returners had fewer yards per kickoff return this past season than Duvernay, despite being at 25.1. He made the Pro Bowl at 25.5 a couple of years ago because Pro Bowl is sort of just all returning, but punt return is definitely a lot more his strength, despite him having 2 kickoff return touchdowns. The home run ability is there, but the more consistent yardage and field position he's been able to give his teams comes on punts, whereas kickoffs has been a little bit more meddling, a little bit more average there. And so that's where the questions start to arise for me as far as what the Bears want to do from a kick return standpoint, and how much he's making on this contract will go a long way there. But he also has room to fit in this wide receiver depth chart as far as how he's going to fit on offense. And also, like, this wide receiver depth chart will also be determined in part by special teams as well. So I want to take a look at how he plugs in behind DJ Moore and Rome Odunze and whose spots are up for grabs here at wide receiver next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Upwork. Scaling your business requires the right expertise at the right time. With Upwork, you can find specialized freelancers in marketing, development, design, and more, all experts ready to help you take your business to the next level. Upwork gives business flexibility by connecting them with top freelance talent across multiple industries, including IT, AI, web development, and marketing. So whether you need extra hands for a project or a long-term partner, Upwork makes hiring simple and affordable. Posting a job is free and simple, and with a day, you'll have multiple qualified candidates to choose from. And instead of having to hire full-time, Upwork helps find affordable top-tier freelancers to scale your business efficiently. Visit Upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's UPWORK, Upwork.com, to connect with the top talent and grow your business today. Locked On Bears is also brought to you by Gametime, the best place to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I have the Gametime app on my phone, and I use it all the time. I've bought concert tickets on Gametime, gone to comedy shows, theater events, and of course, sports. Going to basketball games. I've been to Bears games, and especially with the college basketball tournament going on, if you want to go see your team playing, Gametime is going to be a great place to get your tickets, last-minute deals in particular, at unbeatable prices. They got a feature called Gametime Picks that curates the best value for tickets for not even for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, you name it. Instead of having to sift through all the different sections and find the deal that's right for you, Gametime Picks finds the best value based on the prices of those tickets to make sure that you know you're getting the best deal. And they've got a lowest price guarantee where Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference if you can find the same seat for less, or a seat in the same row and section for less somewhere else. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So Devin Duvernay isn't going to come to Chicago and be some dynamic offensive weapon necessarily. That's not reasonable expectations given the production he's had in his career. But he is some important depth at a wide receiver position that was otherwise looking thin behind DJ Moore and Rome Odunze. And right away, he's pushing the backup spots to where I think someone like Tyler Scott, the 4th-round pick from a couple seasons ago, his roster spot is by no means guaranteed. Do I think he's going to make the 53-man roster still in year 3? Yeah, probably, most likely. If you could bet on that, I would probably bet on him making the team versus not. But when somebody like Duvernay comes in, on top of somebody like Olamide Zaccheaus coming in, plus whatever else the Bears may still add at wide receiver in the NFL draft, potentially undrafted free agency, and the other people they've brought back on reserve and future contracts, all of a sudden, you've got a pretty nice open battle here for a few different wide receiver spots that I think is going to be interesting to watch in training camp. Obviously, DJ Moore is your number 1 wide receiver. Rome Odunze is your number 2. I guess we can have a conversation about as far as like, is there a point eventually where Odunze could overtake that, but not right now, not today, right? Like he's not there yet as a rookie wide receiver or a year 2 wide receiver. I think given recent production history, the signing of Olamide Zaccheaus makes him your incumbent number 3 wide receiver when it comes to, when you come to training camp, he will be the favorite to be the number 3 wide receiver. But we have not seen the financial details yet of his contract, and that will also determine like how guaranteed his spot is and how high the Bears may view him as an offensive weapon for them. But like between Zaccheaus and Tyler Scott, and now you plug in someone like Devin Duvernay in there, you got Samori Toure, who they brought back from the Green Bay Packers, as well as a couple of other, training camp body type of players they have on this roster. Like there's a real competition there that I think can be considered up in the air. I think there's a possibility here, not a likelihood, but a possibility where, if Duvernay can get back to the kind of production he had in Baltimore, like that's absolutely somebody who could, in theory, win a training camp battle there and be more of a number 3 receiver in this offense and kind of work his way up that depth chart ahead of the likes of Zaccheaus and Tyler Scott. Like it's Zaccheaus' job to lose for sure, but it's not something that's necessarily a sure thing or handed to him as going to be great. Like, yes, he had a good season this past season with Commanders, and he played with the Eagles before that, and he kind of had drop-offs at time in his career as well. It's not as though he's going to be some perfectly proven option here that absolutely changes how the Bears offense is going to look. Like, same thing with Tyler Scott. Like, as much as Scott had 1 catch for 5 yards this last season, and his rookie season was only 17 catches for 168 yards. Like, it's not as though that Tyler Scott is going to come in with any kind of expectations to be great, but year 3, new offense, new receiving coach, maybe if things just click for him at this stage, like there's an opportunity there for him to carve out a lane. Like I don't think somebody like Duvernay is guaranteed spots above Scott. Like Duvernay may end up getting that and being the number 4 and Scott being the number 5 or whatever it ends up looking like. But a lot of that also is going to come down to special teams. Duvernay is going to have at least a role in a competition to be the return man, and is most likely going to be at least your punt returner, if not both your punt returner and kick returner. So that makes him a lot easier to keep on the 53-man roster, even if he's not making as much of a contribution on offense as he is on special teams. Like that's still a really clear ticket to a roster spot. Someone like Tyler Scott is going to have to step up his special teams experience and his offerings at that part of the game in order to really make this 53-man roster this past season, because he got in on the return game a little bit at the end of last season, and then finally carved out a role. Like in the final 3 weeks of the season, he played on the kickoff return team as a blocker, or as a return man, and a little bit up front, and then got some opportunities to be the gunner on punt coverage. But other than that, he didn't do a ton of special teams in 2024. And if he's not going to carve out a major role on offense, he's got to carve out a role on special teams, and it's just not something that he has necessarily proven a consistent ability to do. They had him do a little bit more of that during the preseason, but never really consistently cracked the Bears' special teams lineups. But a guy like Zaccheaus has some return experience, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here. He's a guy who's played some other special teams roles throughout his career in terms of working on the coverage units here and there. It's kind of varied by how much he's being used as a return man. He does a little bit less as a coverage unit guy when he's being used as a return man more, but nonetheless, he's got more special teams experience and background than Tyler Scott. And so I think when you keep adding receivers like this, where say Zaccheaus is the number 3, Duvernay is the number 4, Scott becomes the number 5. And if he can't carve out a role on offense that's more than what we've seen before, then his spot's going to come down to what he's able to do on special teams. And if you draft a wide receiver, or if one of these camp guys the Bears have, like Samori Toure or Maurice Alexander or John Jackson, there's an opportunity here for another wide receiver to end up cracking this 53-man roster, even though Scott's a former 4th-round pick, and you want to give a former 4th-round pick as many opportunities as they can to be successful, and you drafted them for a reason, and you believe in their ability to offer you some real value on offense and maybe also special teams. When you get to this stage of the process, it's put up or shut up time, and some of these end of the roster, end of the bench guys have spent their whole careers just trying to carve out a special teams role, whereas maybe now Scott is now starting to have more special teams pressure on him and having to do more there, but is maybe playing catch up a little bit comparatively. And I do think he's someone whose roster spot grows more and more in danger with every Bears addition at wide receiver. Now, if they leave wide receiver exactly as it stands today, you probably know your top 5 then are more Odunze, Zaccheaus, Duvernay, Scott, and then you decide whether you want to keep a 6th or not. But I think they'll bring in a little bit more from here. Maybe not another free agent signing, but at least a little bit more than what they have right now. I think the real path then for Scott is to show that he can provide more value on the kickoff return game than what Duvernay does, and force the Bears to have to keep 2 wide receivers that are part-time special teams players and part-time offensive players. And we'll kind of look at what the Bears' options are in the return game and whether this goes to Duvernay by default or whether we like any of their other options on the roster next on Locked On Bears.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the Bracket Breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
When Devin Duvernay was signed, I think there's this immediate assumption that, okay, 2-time Pro Bowl return man, lock him in, pencil him in. He's the Bears' punt returner and kickoff returner this season. And, well, I think, first of all, nothing's guaranteed. I think it's pretty likely he's probably your punt returner because that's really been his specialty. But coming off of a down year with the Jacksonville Jaguars, you're counting on him to be better, but there's always an if there. And, you can't always assume that that's going to be the case, especially when the Bears do have other return man options. Like, as much as the plan is absolutely for the Bears hoping for Duvernay to handle both punts and kickoff returns and be good to go, the Bears have other options in case that is not how it plays out, in case Duvernay struggles and doesn't bounce back, or in case he gets injured or whatever it might be. Like, it's not Duvernay or bust. They do have other options in case of emergency, and it's a way for some of these other guys to create more value for themselves. We talked about earlier how Duvernay had a career low in yards per punt return this past season and in total punt return yards. Like, it was a down year for him in Jacksonville for sure. And You can blame the blocking and special teams coaching if you want, or you can blame Duvernay some, or a little bit of both. We don't know exactly what the primary cause was there. And then he's been kind of, average at the kickoff return game in recent years. And this past season, his yards per return was among the bottom in the NFL. And so there's an opportunity here for, yes, he's the plan A, but if somebody else comes to training camp and lights the world on fire as either a punt returner or especially as a kickoff returner, there might be an opportunity here for somebody else to get in on this return game plan. We talked about it earlier with Tyler Scott. Like when you look at players on the Bears roster right now with any kind of NFL experience as a kickoff return person, the only two names that really jump out are Tyler Scott and Travis Homer, the running back, who, Homer hasn't done it in quite some time, but earlier in his career with the Seattle Seahawks, he was their primary kick return man for his first couple of seasons and had some big returns for them. He ended up returning one last year for the Bears when they had some injuries at kick returner. Tyler Scott also ended up returning kickoffs last season when the Bears were trying to figure out what that was going to look like, and I think DeAndre Carter was hurt for a little bit. Tyler Scott returned 8 kickoffs for 207 yards, a 25.9 yards per kickoff return average. So Tyler Scott averaged more yards on kickoff returns last season than Devin Duvernay. That's not to say that means Tyler Scott should be the kick returner and is going to win the competition and he's your guy. But it goes to show you that, hey, there's an opportunity there where if Scott's been working on his speed and his return game and his ability to set up blocks and everything and comes into training camp and the preseason and has some big kickoff returns, that can be his way onto the 53-man roster to say, I'm a kickoff returner who can offer a little bit on some of the other coverage units and still has some offensive upside, and Duvernay can be the punt returner who can play some other special teams and has a little bit of offensive upside. There can be room for both on the 53-man roster and both as returners for the Chicago Bears. But it's not even a guarantee then either that for sure Duvernay is the punt returner there. That's definitely been Duvernay's strength and the area that I think the Bears are probably most excited about for him as a punt returner. But he's not their only option as a punt returner. I mean, when they signed Olamide Zaccheaus, he spent this past season as a punt returner for the Washington Commanders. And this past season, he averaged 10.5 yards per punt return. It's not over the top or anything, but it's more than Devin Duvernay averaged this past season in Jacksonville, right? It's not again, it's not as good as what Duvernay has been in the past when he was a Pro Bowler, but Zaccheaus has punt return upside for the Bears there. I don't think they signed Zaccheaus envisioning that he would have to be their number one punt returner, but it's an option for them. And, as a number 3 receiver on offense, it's not he's got too big of a role on offense to use as a punt returner. That's the conversation we've had before about Rome Odunze, who did a little bit of returning in college, has a punt return touchdown in college at Washington. And it's could he be the Bears punt? He did a couple kickoffs as well. Could he return kicks for the Bears? It's a possibility in a pinch, but being the number 2 wide receiver in this offense, you don't necessarily want to use up his stamina and also put him at risk of more hits by putting the ball in his hand as a return man. But it's always an option in their back pocket. I don't know how much they'll actually practice it, but that's one, but he doesn't have NFL experience doing it, so I'm not sure how much you want to include him in there. Or you've got Josh Blackwell, the backup nickel cornerback that the Bears re-signed. He returned 7 punts last season for the Bears, averaged over 20 yards per punt return because of the 94-yard punt return touchdown he had. You might remember the play where they pulled off the Devin Hester, Johnny Knox switcheroo where the other return man, I don't even remember who was it, Carter on that play, pretended to catch it, but it was actually Blackwell who went and caught it where the ball was, and then no one stayed with Blackwell and he ran it back for a touchdown. Blackwell has legit punt returning experience. He also did one kickoff last season in the rotation of kickoff return mans. Blackwell has real return ability and upside there. He has scored a touchdown as a punt returner, something that Devin Duvernay has not actually done in his career. Duvernay is absolutely the favorite for both of these spots. Duvernay is being signed with the idea that he will play both of these spots. But I just don't think it's something where it's all right, game over, guaranteed, this is who the Bears are going to put there. Especially, if you go into this NFL draft and you get a running back or a wide receiver, not in the first round necessarily. You wouldn't put Ashton Genty in this role. But say you draft a running back in the 3rd round or, in the 5th round or a wide receiver, I suppose, who has some return ability, who has great speed. Like, that's another player who could come into Chicago and beat out Duvernay for one of these return game spots, or Duvernay does punts and that rookie does kickoffs, or whatever that might end up being. Right there's room for more than just Duvernay as the kick return man, and I think the details of the contract are really going to go a long way towards telling us how likely he is to win those roles, and then also like just how good of a deal, how good of a signing does this actually end up being for the Bears? Because if Duvernay's on a 1-year deal worth like $1 or $2 million, like close to veteran minimum without a bunch of guarantees, it's definitely worth taking a flyer on a return man who's been a 2-time Pro Bowler, who has return touchdowns, has been a difference maker as a return man for sure. If you're having to pay him, $3 or $4 or $5 million to come here after such a bad year in Jacksonville, well, then that becomes a lot riskier of a signing, especially because I touched on it briefly, but like Duvernay has been injured the last like 3 seasons. He's been on injured reserve the last 2 with hamstring injury, and I think it was like an ankle injury or something the year before that. Like, he's missed 3 or 4 games, or 4 or 5 games each of the last 3 seasons. So that just adds more to like, we'll see exactly how well this plays out. Same thing with Olamide Zaccheaus as a signing as well. We haven't seen the numbers on that deal. We did finally get contract details on the tight end, the number 2 tight end, Durham Smythe. It was a 1-year, $2.5 million contract with like $1.5 million guaranteed. Maybe a little bit more than I thought it would be, but all in all, not that big of a deal. Literally not that big of a contract, and also not that big of a deal in terms of like big deal. So I think the Bears are proceeding with caution with these sort of later free agency, second wave, third wave at this point, like bottom tier signings. These are going to be shorter, 1-year deals that aren't generally that expensive because the Bears just don't have a ton of salary cap space left. But Duvernay was a cap casualty from the Jacksonville Jaguars for a reason. They'd signed him to a bigger contract, didn't want to bring him back for year 2, so his price tag should, in theory, be coming to the Bears then quite a bit down further than it would. If the Bears bring in more competition for this kick return game, or more wide receivers, more weapons for Caleb Williams, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that we're in the thick of the offseason, the draft is right around the corner. You can get the latest rankings, rumors, and draft news every single day. You can find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to Locked On Bears. Coming back tomorrow because I'd like to have a more in-depth conversation about Ashton Jeanty and where the Bears might or should draft a running back in this year's class. I also want to take a look at the possibility of, in a separate conversation, the possibility of trading up from the 10th overall pick, the possibility from trading up from your second round pick, trying to move up in the second round instead of moving up in the first round, and also how it feels like the Bears are in a tricky spot with the number 10 overall pick as far as who might still be there when they're on the clock and missing out on some of the top guys that you might want. So a lot more draft talk coming in the near future here on Locked On Bears. So make us your first listen once again tomorrow for another opportunity to bear down.